leave it to Daniel. Start us off.
I'll leave you to it.
Well, I am so pleased to welcome you all this afternoon to mark the opening of our new permanent collection. Exhibition, an earth song, body song, figures with landscape, that Daniel has curated for us here. Daniel Duford has an exhibition on view also here. And I was telling him earlier that I feel like having this show open now, I feel really rounds out this third season that we have here on view at Optima Expand. And welcome, come on in. We're just so pleased to be able to share it all with you and some of the ideas behind the exhibition. Just quickly before we get started, I wanted to welcome Christine Jones from the OC Libraries. We have a wonderful new partnership with Christine and the libraries, and she's just going to say a few words about some of their programs. So I will let her do that, and then.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Jones, and I work at the Costa Mesa Donald Duncan Library, the brand new library that opened on May 24th, 23,000 square feet. Yes, I've studied all this on May 24th. We're super excited to be there. There's a 1-acre park out front. For those of you that may not be familiar with the area, it's at 19th and Park Avenue. We have lots of upcoming events, lots of book clubs. We have an Irish cooking class coming up. Many things, and I'm super excited for the partnership and all the programs we're going to be doing with Orange County Museum of Art. Thank you very much. And I forgot to mention, flyers are downstairs at the desk.
So you are all in for such a treat today. We have just an amazing conversation, I know, just based on the little exchange that I've heard earlier this afternoon between these two amazing thinkers. I will first tell you a little bit about Daniel, who's here on the left. Daniel Duford is an artist, writer, and teacher. He tells stories drawn from North American history and mythology. He is a 2019 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, a 2010 Hallie Ford Fellow, and a recipient of a 2012 Art Matters grant. His books include John Brown's Body, The Unfortunates graphic novel, The Naked Boy and the Green Man of Portland. His works have been shown at Mass MoCA, the Atlanta Center for Contemporary Art, Mary Hill Museum, Bellevue Arts Museum, Clay Studio, the Boise Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Craft, and the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art. He has taught at Reed College, Portland Community College, and Pacific Northwest College of Art. So, please join me in welcoming. And to my left is Camille T. Dungy. Her debut collection of personal essays is Guidebook to Relative Strangers, published by W.W. Norton in 2017. She is a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She is also the author of 4 collections of poetry, most recently, Tropic Cascade, winner of the Colorado Book Award. Dungy also edited Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, and co-edited 2 other anthologies. Her poems and essays have appeared in Best American Poetry, 100 Best African American Poems, Best American Essays, and over 30 other anthologies, plus dozens of print and online venues. She was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2019, so you can see how they made that connection. Other honors include 2 Northern California Book Awards, a California Book Award Silver Medal, 2 NAACP Image Award nominations, 2 Hurston Wright Legacy Award nominations, and fellowships from the NEA in both poetry and prose. Dungy is currently a professor in the English department at Colorado State University. She lives in Fort Collins, Colorado, with her husband and child, who we're grateful is here today. To say that we're grateful to have you here is an understatement, and I will hand the floor over to you both and let you take it from there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cassandra. And thank you all for coming today. I'm just going to say a couple quick things before Camille begins to read. So I just want to thank Orange County Museum of Art for having us and having this opportunity to be able to, as an artist, to be able to look through a permanent collection is a pretty special thing. and to start to make connections with artists who you really admire. So just a very quick thing, we'll unravel this, or we'll not unravel it. We'll explore it a little bit more as we go in the conversation. But just a quick note about the title of this, or the subtitle of this exhibition is Figures with Landscape. So one of the things we're going to talk about is a flip of what you normally would think about in terms of when you think of landscape or environmental art. It usually is a certain kind of view. All the work in here is chosen because it's including those who have often been left out of that view, and it has a more embodied sense of landscape. And Camille's writing is just so beautifully articulates those ideas. In fact, a lot of this thinking comes from a class I taught called Homeland, the American Landscape, and long before I met Camille, I used Black Nature as one of my books for the class, so I'm very honored to have you come here and talk. So Camille's going to read a few poems, and then we're going to do a conversation after that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. We got to go out to a dinner after the Guggenheim Fellowship reception and had just this delightful conversation about a year ago now. And so it's nice to be able to continue this fellowship together. So I'm going to share about 3 or 4 poems and then read a little excerpt of an essay. And then we'll get to talking. So the first poem is actually the first poem in my first collection, which is called What to Eat, What to Drink, What to Leave for Poison. It also happens to be here in Black Nature, so I'm going to use this. Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice rising so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky, and the coyote's yip knocks it shut. The way the aspen's bells conform to the breeze, while the rapids' drums define resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, pinyon with another. Rock, wind her hand, and water her brush, spells and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather the bank we map our lives around. Thank you. So I grew up not very far from here in Irvine. You're going to hear about that today. But that idea of a landscape following you has stuck with me as part of my creative process all along. And that landscape is not always an idyllic landscape, right? It's often complicated, and sometimes we are the complicators. So, starting in 2017, not living outside of California, but watching, I actually have a California wildfires map app on my phone, and I just watch as places I know are caught up. And out of that came this. This beginning may have always meant this end. Coming from a place where we meandered mornings and met quail, scrub jay, mockingbird, I knew coyote like everyone else. I knew cactus, knew tumbleweed, lichen on rocks and pill bugs beneath, rattlers sometimes, the soft smell of sage and the ferment of cactus pear coming from this place, from a place where grass might grow greener on the hillside in winter than in any yard, where the whole rest of the year, everything I loved, chaparral, pea, bottle brush tree, jacaranda, mariposa, pinyon, and desert oak, kumquat in the backyard and wisteria vining the porch, the dry grass whispering long after the last rains, raccoons in and out of the hills, trash hurled by the hottest wind, the dry grass tall now and golden, lawn chairs, eucalyptus, everything in a place we knew, everything we knew, little and large and mine and ours, except horror, all of it, everything could flame up that quickly, could flare and be gone. All right, notes on what is always with us. This week, I threw a birthday party for my mother, and grief came along for the cake. 10 mothers at my mother's birthday party dinner, 3 of them bereaved of a child. The dead celebrated right there with the living. We asked grief to be quiet, but she smiled, smacked her lips, and tore into the steak. On land, adult penguins have no natural predators. The big bad wolf is not in Antarctica a problem. No lions, no tigers, no bears. Penguin eggs and penguin chicks are always at the mercy of skua and disaster, but from the leopard seal and orca, the land-hauled adult penguin is safe. I am trying to write about penguins, about predatorless terrains. I am trying to write about joy and a kind of cold beauty, but grief won't stay away. Grief will ride in on the smallest of bodies, a tick on a cormorant's wing. If the winter isn't cold enough to kill it, that tick will embed itself in a penguin's neck, the back of her head, anywhere the penguin cannot reach. And because she has no way to tell anyone, and because even if she could convey her agony, there would be no way for her fellow birds to help. She will itch for a while, swell for a while, then abandon her nest to the water's relief. She will run and slide and dive into danger. Her eggs will die and her chicks will die, and she may die as well. I am trying to write about predatorless terrains, but grief will ride in on the smallest of bodies, a tick on a cormorant's wing. I try to write everything down because I know it would be easier to forget. And I want to avoid the comforts of suppression. Scouring journals for my notes about seabird ticks and their toll on Antarctic penguin populations, I find a different set of notes. I'd written, "The only time I really talked to you was in your Trenton kitchen." What I meant was that was the only time I ever saw you genuinely smile. The baby needed food, and you, just back from pushing his stroller on a long walk, during which you and he both watched the morning sun shine on the faded splendor of those Trenton streets, were boiling a hot dog for your only son and smiling. "There are things I do not want to say," I said in my journal, "except the not saying won't return anything you love. The boy is dead. The boy's mother is dead." I was trying to write about beauty, but grief won't stay away. I was trying to write about babies and birthdays and birds. I was trying to write about joy. So one more poem and then this essay excerpt and then talking. Really good, smart talking. Characteristics of life. A fifth of animals without backbones could be at risk of extinction, say scientists. BBC Nature News. Ask me if I speak for the snail, and I will tell you I speak for the snail. I speak of underneathedness and the welcome of mosses, of life that springs up, little lives that pull back and wait for a moment. I speak for the damselfly, water skeet, mollusk, the caterpillar, the beetle, the spider, the ant. I speak from the time before spinelessness was frowned upon. Ask me if I speak for the moon jelly. I will tell you one thing today and another tomorrow, and I will be as consistent as anything alive on this earth. I move as the currents move, with the breezes. What part of your nature drives you? You in your cubicle ought to understand me. I filter and filter and filter all day. Ask me if I speak for the nautilus, and I will be silent as the nautilus shell on a shelf. I can be beautiful and useless, if that's all you know to ask of me. Ask me what I know of longing, and I will speak of distances between meadows of night-blooming flowers. I will speak the impossible hope of the firefly. You, with the candle burning and only one chair at your table, must understand such wordless desire. To say it is mindless is missing the point. Writing home. When I was a girl child, home was a street called Bluffview, the uppermost block in a terraced neighborhood of Southern California houses. In the summer, when I was young and untired and forced to bed before the sun went down, my lullaby was the view my bedroom window afforded of the hills behind my house. Desert oak, prickly pear, eucalyptus, sage. I fell asleep cataloging this place. In the daytime, I would scramble over one bluff and up the hill behind it, playing teacher in the caves my neighbors and I found, scratching lessons in the chalky sand that lined the walls. We played doctor with stethoscopes fashioned from rocks and the necklace stalks of wild mustard. We knew the contours and passages of those hills like we knew the halls and classrooms of our other inside school. Walking down a slope is different than walking on flat land, and each part of my legs recorded required positions until they could move as correctly up and down those bluffs as my tongue might move over the alphabet. My body memorized its place in those hills. But even while I lived at the center of everything I knew erased itself. Before I entered high school, construction had begun on Summit Estates for our town's growing mogul class. The hilltop was leveled and two of my favorite caves were lost. From my bedroom window, I could now see the red tile roof of the Pizza King's Palazzo. Less desert oak, a weaker scent of sage. When my parents bought the house on Bluffview, our backyard marked the edge of human landscaping. It was not uncommon to find tumbleweed resting in our lounge chairs, to leave wild poppies blooming along the margins of cut grass. Now the hills were asphalt and ice plant. The wild dogs we called coyotes moved down into our backyards, fighting with raccoons over scraps from overturned trash cans and preying on small pets. Development in California means the building of homes, the imposition of landscaping, the digging of pools. Development in California means controlling what exists and creating something new, something only the diversion of rivers for the maintenance of reservoirs can sustain. Development in California means the mass irrigation of newly planted lawns, houses everywhere, and not a wild mustard field to see. Not even the acres of organized agriculture that moneyed the region survive. The city of Orange in Orange County kept an orange tree in a fenced area, a skinny branch specimen saved to represent the fields for which the region was named. I grew up on a street called Bluffview in the midst of California's need for development. When I write about nature, I am writing about loss. I am writing about discovering home where home has been replaced by structures I do not want to recognize. The place I was born into no longer exists. I don't have a town I can call home, unless language is home, unless when I write, what had slipped away is found. Once, I knew the silence and wind cry of my California hills. In California, the sky speaks with a clipped tongue. Mountains shoulder into the conversation. The ocean sighs in frustration, and that frustration rolls over us, is fog. Say the sky and the sea have been arguing all night. Say the mountain blanketed itself and withdrew into silence, but the sky and the sea kept at it through the night. Say it is finally morning. When the ocean rolls its wave blue eyes and sighs, no one will believe the bright points the sky still holds onto. When I lived in California, I was at home in the language of sky and mountaintop and sea. But what my parents came to California to find began to slip away, and we moved away as well. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Okay, so there's so many places we could start, but I think we're going to start with this idea that you talk about in a different essay, and we were having this conversation about the naming of things. And so poets name things.
Yeah.
So in the
Obsessively.
Yeah, in the many things you just read, there's very specific naming, and that's a kind of claiming. It's a claiming of the landscape, and also allows you to be claimed by it.
Mm-hmm.
And artists picture things. So like as we're looking around, there's the image makers are doing something similar with images. So when we are talking about landscape as a art or as a kind of written genre of writing, we were talking about how it often is a very removed view. And so the naming, though, is very intimate, because in the essay in which you're talking about naming, you're also talking about the naming of the names that you give to a child and the way you claim it. So this is very intimate. So maybe, do you want to talk a little bit about when you were feeling like, I'm going to write about nature, but I'm also writing about this against this history, in a sense, that keeps you back here looking at things. We talked earlier, we were talking about an essay by W.J.T. Mitchell called Imperial Landscape, where he notes that the traditional landscape view in a painting is a predatory view. You're behind something looking down. So I just want to maybe talk a little bit about that when you come to writing about nature from this idea of naming and this intimacy.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're seeing that. If you guys have had a chance to walk through this exhibit here, we're seeing a similar impulse in a lot of these pieces, and it has something to do with a close eye, a kind of precision of attention. And a fair number of these pieces have some danger. I mean, this fire piece behind me, there's danger and something's at stake. Something is perhaps being lost or has already been lost or is imperiled in some way. And I think that naming drive or that close attention, that need to define something, and I'm going to do like a poet thing and play to a homonym, right? To pin it down, P-I-N and P-E-N. Like that is something to do with this artistic urge to deal with things that are really large and difficult to hold if you don't come to particularity. And the naming is part of that move toward particularity, towards precision, towards detail, towards elegy and memory and memorial and also honoring, right? And so all of those things end up happening. It doesn't work if it's not particular. Hi, Patty. Naming. I went to high school with her. And right, if it's not particular, it doesn't end up having that same potency.
Right, and I think we were talking about too, where, you know, I don't know if anybody is aware of this, but there's a little bit of a climate crisis. I don't know if anyone's noticed that. Not in California, things are fine, right here. But part of that, the place that we're not getting to on a legalistic or political space is the wrong language, or not the wrong language, but a language that stops us from actually getting to what the poet and what the artist is doing, which is that sort of love. Mm-hmm. And it's the specificity used in our legal and political language that actually is used to sever us from that. And so, and we continue to have we were talking about John Muir. John Muir, who wrote Mountains of California. He's well known as this great environmentalist, and he did many things that are admirable. But there's a lot to question about that legacy, and one of which we talked about. There's a passage in Mountains of California where he's like Odysseus or something. He's on the mast of a tree and being blown in a storm, and he says he talks about this view of the landscape, except he completely erases the history of the people who are there. And actually, when he does speak of them, he speaks of them in a derogatory way. And so we still have that cleaving in our language and the way we speak about these. And so that feels like that's one of the reasons we can't quite, as a culture, get to this place where we culturally kind of name and love them.
And by doing so, that we implicate ourselves in this greater than human world, right? That we are part of it all. The Notes on What Is Always With Us poem that I read it partly because it might have troubled your idea of what a nature poem is, right? I'm just talking about my mom's birthday party and whatever, and then there's these penguins, and then the other death that I talk about in it. I'm like, how is that a nature poem? And it's really important to me to always be complicating this idea. I think having grown up in Irvine, when I did especially, when we moved there were 25,000 people in Irvine when we moved there. There's a few more than that now, right? And so that kind of sense of always living in what environmentalists call an ecotone. It's this marginal space. So if I turned in one direction, it was the cul-de-sac streets, and everything was building and was just looked like a normal suburb. And then the back of it was just like chaparral, wild landscape. And that's a condition, I think, that many of us in California are used to, right? We have this kind of borderline between what people might call wild space and what people call human landscape. It's, as it turns out, not the condition that people everywhere in this country experience. And so I think it's part of why Californians are sometimes more ecologically forward-thinking, right? That a lot of the laws in California sometimes tend to be thinking about how to care for these things in a way that's not happening on the national scale because we're in touch with it more. Okay, that idea of not separating ourselves. Daniel and I were also talking earlier about our alternative words for nature, right? I sometimes call it so-called nature. I call it the greater than human world. That word nature is steeped in this kind of John Muir sense of I will go out with my stale bread and march into some wilderness that maybe some savages have been in that they didn't quite know what to do with, but I'm going into it. Meanwhile, by the way, he's left back home, and he's married to this very wealthy woman. He's left this giant farm that other people are taking care of. He's got a Chinese cook who'll cook actual food for him, so he doesn't have to just be eating stale bread. He just chooses to do that. His wife doesn't play the piano, though she's a concert-trained pianist. She doesn't play piano when he's home to let it be quiet for him to write, right? So there's this this disconnect between the reality of daily living and his out there nature. And I want, as an artist, to erase that disconnect, because we're not going to get anywhere in this really necessary, immediately urgent preservation that we have, that we're tasked with now, if we think that nature always is something separate and out there.
Yeah, I prefer the term living world. And it's not perfect, it's kind of clunky, but it's sort of like, the language, if somebody says, I want you to call me they, you might say, well, I don't, that doesn't quite fit, but it's enough to make me stop to think, okay, why? Mm-hmm. And so the living world, that idea is, it actually speaks to the fact that everything around us is alive. So if you look at so the works that are around us, these three particular works that you have Jacob Lawrence over there, which is field workers. This is from a series called The Black Belt, which he did for Fortune magazine. Is that the Fortune magazine? And so this is Jim Crow South. This is sharecroppers who are going out and working. Here you have Alan Sekula. This is images of workers on a dock in Calais. They're delivering sugar, and then here you have these palms on fire. You might say, well, this is about nature. These are not, but they absolutely are. And if we continue to do this, the divide, we are never going to understand. And we're never going to understand the history. We're talking about the fact that we both are really interested in history, in kind of standard landscape art and environmental rhetoric. Often history is left out. It's either this ever-present now, or there's this kind of this very clinical projection to the future. So again, these works are really about the people who are in the actual working landscape. What Timothy Morton calls this dark ecology, which is it's the kind of living world that is our systems where it meets the other systems of rivers and other. So if we can start to realize that these are part of that landscape, then we begin to understand. So if you are in Irvine and you can say, well, you didn't really have a nature experience. There are cul-de-sacs there. That's not real. That's absurd. I mean, if anyone here has ever been startled by a raccoon in the middle of the night, that raccoon is real and it's live and it knows what it's doing, right? So, and I think actually that Jacob Lawrence is a really interesting case because in terms of history, that was one of the pieces that really set the show off. And that is because the history in that, the people in that painting were part of there were people who were promised after emancipation during Reconstruction land so that they could participate in a democracy, and in a power system deprive them of that and turn them back into a place where they were no longer allowed to be rooted. And so that idea of roots that are rooted in a soil, which is that kind of intimacy, is denied them in this system. So there's something that happens doubly in this particular image, is where you have people who are not allowed to be rooted because of the political system. And then in this, you might say, well, they're just itinerant. They're not even part of the landscape. It's not the real thing. So I think when we start to look at these images and we start to think about, okay, what is the living world? The living world is also, it hurts. It's full of pain and memory, and it has to all be considered. It has to all be taken in.
And it's full of just economic questions and law and cultural criticism stuff and gender inequality things and access to power questions. And if we're thinking about landscape art or environmental art, writing, or visual art as only, again, that pristine landscape, no people in it sort of idea, you leave out the fact that, you know, we do have to think about all of these other textbook legalese kinds of questions to really think about how humans live on and in and with the land, right? So the room behind us there has a few pieces that, there's this one that I'm just so taken with, where she's done, Daniel can explain it better, but she's essentially made stencils with smog and has created these stencils with the particulate matter over a month's time or something like that in LA, right? Yeah. And then this other one with the tree that's shaped with like individual color patterns of the tree. Again, I'm obviously the writer to talk to him about what's happening with the details of the art. But what's interesting to me in this is that they defamiliarize us with how we expect to see a tree. They defamiliarize us with this kind of idea that a tree is an it thing out there that is objectified in a particular way that we're used to seeing it. And it shifts and changes our ways of interacting with that, renames it, essentially, for us. And so that we pay attention to it, again, differently, and I think more viscerally and actually.
Yeah, and I think like those pieces in particular, so you have Charles Gaines on one hand takes the image of a tree and he turns it into a system of numbers and images, and he removes any kind of romanticism from it. Next to that, you have Jay DeFeo doing the tree, that's like a tree that is the tree of your imagination, the tree that we remembered. In my drawing class, when I teach, I do an exercise where I have students I give words like nouns, and I give them 30 seconds to draw it. And this is like my showing them that anyone can draw, and that your drawing is a kind of voice. And so one of them is a tree, and I'm like, I don't know how to draw it. Like, yeah, you draw a tree, I will know it's a tree because there's an ancestral memory of what that means. And to me, that image, and it's really exciting to see that pairing, because the one is this like really raw kind of material way of dealing with this archetypal tree. The other one is like, now I'm going to take the image of the tree and I am going to so dissect it that it actually goes through the dissection and comes alive again as something else. And that's another particular discipline. And so as you look through the show, I feel like you start to see these instances of also conversation where the thing that might not be allowed to say, like you said, like I wrote a nature poem, but it's about my mom's birthday. So we have these rules of like, well, that's not about the nature. That's so like why the one question would be like, why would this Viola Fry be in there? This, which is the platter, it's called swimmer with swimmer with one possession and one possession. I looked at that and I was like, that's the Anthropocene. Like that's what I thought of in her work. So if anyone knows about Viola Fry, was a great sculptor, really, in my mind, appreciated ceramic sculptor from the Bay Area. She was less than 5 feet tall, but made these monumental sculptures, many of them of men in business suits, and they were towering over her. They had a lot to do with her dad, and so I'm like, well, that's the patriarchy. She is there, and she's creating these totemic images, and in this one, here it is, like this is the swimming through the detritus of the flood. So I think these things, these images and these poems touch on these themes, because if you think of the living world not as nature, but as a web of things that are all connected, you can actually begin to see how they speak to each other.
I want to talk about bodies, but I feel like we should take a little break for poetry so I can read that Langston Hughes poem.
Oh, right.
Yeah, because I forgot to do that. I was so focused on myself, I forgot Langston Hughes. It happens sometimes.
Right, we haven't even mentioned those.
Yeah, so here's the poem from which the title of the show came, and then I have some thoughts. Earth Song. It's an Earth song, and I have been waiting long for an Earth song. It's a spring song. I've been waiting long for a spring song, strong as the bursting of young buds, strong as the shoots of a new plant, strong as the coming of the first child from its mother's womb. An earth song, a body song, a spring song, and I've been waiting long for an earth song. I love that poem. So that idea that this connection and this desire comes from our body, right? From the mother's womb, and I've been waiting long, and this idea of we get to appreciate this because we have these bodies, right? And hopefully one of the things that we begin to appreciate are other living bodies, right? Those cohabitant bodies who also, I'm too short for this chair, that's why I keep standing up, that we need to connect. And I think so frequently, I mean, I'm like actually looking at a body. When I sort of peek over my shoulder there to the right. Like if we think about so many of these pieces in here, I think that is one of the other things about a lot of contemporary environmental work that's doing this thing that Daniel and I are talking towards. It's pushing past these more 19th century boundaries, is that they are a much more embodied look, and they think about kind of how like a knee or a particular ant or a particular tree or the bodies who are moving sugar or Leda and the swan, like how are these individual bodies in this larger landscape surviving, managing, but also sometimes hopefully thriving.
Right, and actually what we now know about bodies is that like, so our bodies aren't really our own anyway. There's like all this other
stuff happening. Right, we got all that microbiome in our
and then
gut.
there's all this stuff around us, and then there's connections. And so that these pieces in particular, this is a story of bodily transformation. And these kind of, and the reason I thought about including this in the show one is that body transformation where, you know, the boundary between swan and woman is gone. And up until recently, we as human beings understood that. We understood it that when you tell a story like this, these old myths, these old folk stories, they're not just stories, like even things like, I've been reading a lot about mythology and folk tales. And when you hear a story that's even Little Red Riding Hood, which has now become cleaned up and then it's gone through the culture, and it's like, you know, Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf, that's old. That's like thousands of years old. That's like an ancestral memory that's telling us the world is talking to us. And it's actually ours, it's not our stories. Like I feel like in poetry, this is why I think poetry is really potent for this kind of discussion, is that it's actually coming from somewhere else. I feel like this when I'm really on it, when I'm making an image, and I can't speak for you, but I think there's a moment where like, I don't know if I made the poem or the poem made itself. Like clearly I'm using my craft to control it to some extent, but there's things come up and you don't realize. So and the vessel itself, I mean, it's literally a vessel, but it's clay, and that potency of even just the form of a vessel, which is a body to be filled by something that has this image. I think that's an important component to this. And then particularly if like from where we're sitting, you see Leda and the Swan, and then you see the Joan Semmel. And so the other thing about the 19th century landscape, you know, the way we talk about nature, women are natural. If you are black, indigenous, if you're anything but a white, you're natural, right?
A wealthy one, because if you're a white farmer, you're also also like the leech gatherer, you know,
exactly right.
like floating
Except
out there.
the rich guys don't tell them that. they tell them that, you know. But that's and even again, like, just to pick on John Muir a little bit because he's not here to defend himself, but that even if he might not acknowledge that is the source of that particular belief system. So when you look at something like that Joan Semmel, which I just think is an astounding painting, it's just we were talking about looking at these paintings where you first look at them in a thumbnail and you don't have a sense of their scale. So it's not only the scale, but it's the depth of the painting. This view of a woman's body, which is clearly meant to mimic the landscape, is a reclaiming in a sense. It is also a reclaiming from Renoir, who is, you know, so there's a couple of places where that's happening. So I think these are, when you look at these three pieces in a line, it's almost as if it was planned that way, as if somebody thought to put these together. Actually, it was a bit of a, you know, like we didn't know what these were going to look like together necessarily, but once they're up, we knew they were going to speak to each other. So you have Viola Fry and Jerry Rothman, and then that, and these are all talking about bodies and transformation, you know. So I do think that this reclaiming of the body as a source, not as something that's separate, not as something that's meant to be overlooked or overcome, but that's actually the thing. It is the thing.
And is also permeable with the other than human, right? So that poem that I read, Characteristics of Life, where I kind of like imagine myself into the vines of the nautilus and the jellyfish and all these other creatures that we don't really think of as mindful creatures, right? But why not? And what are the ways in which that is empowering to everyone if we really begin to have some permeability of the experience of which bodies have primacy and importance.
And so I'm also realizing, as we have a couple other things to talk about, which we all can't get up, but hopefully we've all walked around, if you haven't, you know, go into this other room. So then we have in this room, there are three pieces that then deal with, going back to the essay about is the invisible landscape, which is that part of the landscape, which is the thing that is a collection of stories, of memories,
and also of like home,
and
neighborhood.
Right. And so there's so you look at, so you have one piece of Daniel Martinez, which is a blueprints based on Ted Kaczynski's cabin, which were based on Thoreau's cabin. So Thoreau, who I feel like always gets misunderstood by misanthropic men. This is, you know, his thing was about civil disobedience and about, you know, everyone gives Thoreau a hard time. Like, he didn't go out in nature, he lived in, but that was his point. He was trying to say, everything's right here under you. Ted Kaczynski's reading of it was, I'm going to go into the thing, and I'm going to build bombs. You know, so a very different read, but all of that has to do with power. It has to,
civil disobedience.
Yeah. And then you have the Corey Newkirk and then the Edgar Arsenault, both of those dealing with memories, cultural memories, and the imprint on the landscape and what that image does. And so that is also another really important part of thinking about our relationship to a place and home.
And the Corey Newkirk, which may well be my favorite piece in this exhibit, is really cool if you haven't seen it yet. Don't touch it, even though you want to. Is that it has this nostalgia is embedded in it, and I think that is also such an important aspect of how most of us in this moment, I think most people all the time, but particularly in this moment in a different way, because as we're facing this environmental catastrophe and like the what's next of like what is our home planet going to look like in 15, 20, 70 years, that has like a really high resonance. We've been kind of bad-mouthing 19th century environmental thought, and I'm gonna add this one really important point that I think people tend to forget in England in particular. The rise of English Romanticism was happening during the time of the Enclosure Acts, where people were being removed from their ancestral homes, and these big parcels of land were being blocked off for the 1% at the time, right? It was like the royalty was enclosing the space. You could no longer go onto this land and hunt where you'd always been hunting. You couldn't ramble freely. It took England about 120 years to get free movement again, so that my friend and I could like go wandering through getting lost. But that's like there were 100 years in England where you couldn't move with liberty, and that came to America and stayed, right? Like we don't have that kind of liberal ability to just walk around except for in our national parks and those kinds of places. So this sense of nostalgia of what's lost, what's going away, what won't ever be for your children what it was for you, that's embedded in the landscape art and poetry, right? Now we have this new version of it. And so these nostalgia pieces that look at home and remind us of what a 1970s home or 1980s home would have looked like, or what it would look like for the exodusers to have to leave, right? That is part of this question of writing environmental art, is a longing for a home that you've loved at some point and that you're never going to be able to get back to.
I feel like we really are at a crucial moment, and I do feel like it's going to be up to, it sounds so self-important, but I do think it is up to poets and image makers of any kind to start to remind us, it's all there. All of the stuff that we're talking about is all right in front of us. Like everything, all the history is there, all the knowledge is there. We just have to recalibrate our view and look again and see, oh, what I need is right here. I had an interesting exchange with a student the other night. In my night drawing class, I was playing Life on Mars, by David Bowie, and she said, oh my God, I know that song. She said, that SpaceX played that when they blasted a Tesla out into space. I'm like, what? And she said, I'm a real space nerd. Like, it's really cool. He decided to, like, in the thing he was doing to announce that he blasted a Tesla into space. I was like, the car. And I said, not the man, the car. And I said, well, wait, so it's just orbiting, there's a Tesla, like, he's like, and then there's another guy in the class who's like a computer programmer who said, oh no, it's even better than that. It's like, he is in a trajectory out into space, and he said all of his things he's designing are so he can colonize Mars. And I was like, oh, for God's sake, the last thing we need right now is to colonize Mars. I mean, I guess if David Bowie were doing it, I'm okay with that. But, Elon Musk.
He may be there.
Yeah,
yesterday was his day, Died a year ago, or 4 years ago yesterday.
But I think that is an extreme example of what we're up against in terms of a viewpoint, which is, one is saying explore, go out, it's empty out there. The other is to say it's all right here. It's all right, everything is right here, and we just really need to reimagine the space, which we have everything we need. We don't need the Teslas out in space.
You know what else we're up against? Cassandra. She's like walking towards us.
Okay. But I wanted to tell her about a dream I had. It's kind of a little.
There'll be time for that. But I thought it might be nice to open it up to some questions from the audience if other things come up.
They look smart. They look like they'll have good questions. Oh, I made them shy though. Yes.
One of the things that neither of you talked about, but is very much on my mind right now, is population.
Yeah.
The fact that when we talk about our landscapes and peopling our landscapes, you can think about a grid, and 50 years ago there was one person on that square, one person on that square, and then, but what happens when all the squares get filled with people?
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that, what that means as far as environment, or it's somehow in the back of our heads, but it never comes to the front.
You know what? It's actually a touchy subject. I had an experience with holiday where we were talking about overpopulation. We're seriously overpopulated right now. And I had a young person, about a 30-year-old, come to me and say, I have a right to have my 2 or 3 children. You had your 2 children, I have a right to have my children. And of course that means we continue to expedite our population. And I had to think about that. My comment was selfish because I don't want to have any more people around me. But her comment was valid and selfish too.
Daniel and I are both one child parents, so we have that less than replacement in our family. So we can talk about that. We can make
Well, it's interesting because when you hear a lot of people talking about things that we could be doing. I actually heard on NPR there was a story about farming practices and eating plant-based diets, but it's often then said there's a carbon footprint, but it's often said, how are we going to feed all these people? Which is to your point, and so that is really that's the unasked thing that.
Well, I think we all have to begin to think differently.
Right.
The 30-year-old has to begin to think differently, and we have to think differently also. Because you have a chance to be an enslaver in one life doesn't mean you have to do it now.
Right.
So you have to start thinking differently about your life in the environment at this time. And that 30-year-old doesn't have that right anymore. That right was taken away.
And I think a lot of the issues that we're talking about with a way of thinking about nature as something separate that you go into, that's set aside, that also is a luxury based on the enclosure. It's based on the luxury that there's something set aside for a few people. But if you rethink it, where you think, okay, maybe those square miles are being filled, but if they could be filled in such a way where it has less impact. That's the other thing. We don't need to, I need a couple cars because I need the Hummer for weekdays. Everyone else though,
But I'm just going to say, I think one of the things that's said here is the rethinking, and that's part of what art does, right? Part of what art does is it provides new modes of thinking, new ways for us to build our imaginations of what is possible in the world. And so much of what we have had actualized in the world came from somebody's imagination at some point. And if we as artists can be doing that imagining in a way that provides, I write really exciting things about having a single child. It's great, she wants to have 7 children, brothers and sisters, but I write really well about that. And so it's possible that people who then read that work say, oh, I had only imagined that a family could have 2 or 3, but look, through this memoir, I'm seeing this really incredibly joyful life that you can have with a single child, right? So that's a way in which, as an artist, I might be providing a new architecture for possibility. There's a hand in that.
I was thinking about this show in relationship to the environment. I'm both a writer and an artist. I was running late at the gym because I was absolutely fascinated. I was disgusted with the news. On one side next to me was the opposite channel. And all of a sudden the fire comes up, and there's a loud cell phone, and all of a sudden we're talking about the fires of Australia. And we were both turned off our channels and having a real conversation. So I think the catastrophe, at least I hope in my heart, I think it can bring people together of opposite views. And if we don't start talking, I don't know what we're going to do. What action we can take.
Yes.
I was raised with the idea that art tells us who we are. And I think when you apply that, and the photo mural behind you certainly says it all, because no matter how much we treasure sugar, the machine has to move it for us, and in the end, we make the stacks, not the sugar, not the machine, not the artist. So when you look at art as a vehicle to tell us who we are, it kind of simplifies the mystery of the creation.
I absolutely agree with that sense that art reflects who we are, and I also like to take it a step further, and it tells us who we can be, or who we could be and might be. It doesn't always do that, but at its best, I think that's one of its possibilities.
So I studied ecology in undergrad, and one thing that's interesting is the selecting which species to remove and which species to reintroduce. And the politics get very interesting, where we could, in theory, bring California to a more original state by reintroducing grizzly bears, but the biggest opponents are hikers for all these reasons. And I wonder if you could comment on kind of how we're trying to reshape the world to what it quote-unquote once was, but to do that, it's probably going to take cloning and very intensive programs to get there.
And other things will unbalance, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you guys have all these kind of mountain lion issues in the mid-peninsula around Monterey and Santa Cruz, California. There was just the mid-peninsula open space ordinance was like, we lease our land to ranchers, and we've had 4 cattle kills. And so we're going to remove the mountain lions. And everybody's like, but no, right? And so there was actually an uproar about that, but it was like the ranchers were losing livestock, right? And yet they're leasing land on the open space, but their leasing of the land on the open space helps pay for that open space. And like, it's this complicated, not quite balance, right? It's not a balance that we're having, and we have to kind of keep figuring out how to have it not all topple over.
And I think that's a value system that I was referring to when we were talking about the Leda and the Swan, or these other kinds of stories, is that there is a history in humanity. I mean, I think humans have always been, like wherever there are humans, there's usually something that's disrupted. But you could say that about beavers, because beavers actually shape the waterways of North America. Part of this is like when you mentioned like the bears and the hikers, part of that could be just like we need to actually start to, if we understood that the bears have a right and the bears speak to us, and when I say that, I understand that the bear isn't speaking to me in English, but we understood, like, we understood that. So if there's a way to say, you know what, the bear has a right to be here, I have a right to, maybe I won't hike there. But we still have a very kind of colonial, manifest destiny way of thinking about who we are in the world. Even those of us who are like the most, might be the most sympathetic to that view, you still like, well, yeah, I know, but I want to go hiking. And so I think that's where we have to kind of get to a point where we understand a different relationship with the things that are around us. We have to actually do it with each other. We have to do that, like culturally, we have to do that to understand, like, I can't do it. I can't have 3 kids. It was great. Robert De Niro, you're not 50 years old. I just saw The Irishman. I don't know if that's, but there's that, I think that's part of it, is to understand this relationship that says, like, we actually have to, it's not a loss to curtail some of the movement. I mean, I even think of flying down here today. It's really convenient. It'd be really hard for me to drive. I live in Portland, Oregon, so it'd be really hard for me to get down here. It might take a few days. I don't know, maybe at some point I rethink that, you know? So those, anyway, that's would be my answer to that. I don't have like the, you know, I don't have the answer to that, but that's what I think we have to start moving towards.
I was just thinking when she said, I was reading this morning about it in England, they're having this problem with deer, and they're having to go in and slaughter deer because they said they're ruining nature, the deer are ruining nature. And they're talking about how they're going to control the deer, but it's because we fenced in all the land and we took away all the predators. And now we're going in and wholesale slaughtering deer. And it's so funny that we have to save nature, but it's like we caused the problem. So it's just our relationship, it just reminds me of what we're talking about.
We didn't talk about that room with the was it the last Indian picture and the
James Luna and then the Leon Golub and
And so I'm thinking about that. If you can't see it, it has that iconic. What is it? A Rivington picture of like that, like slumped over native warrior, kind of acquiescing the West, and then superimposed on top of it is a contemporary indigenous person on a sawhorse. And so one of the things that image does, and then one next to it that's the upside down map with the commentary on it, is it kind of reminds us that our ideas about what happened and what this place is and what it looks like and who is here and was here are flawed, right? And so if we circle back to this question of the deer or the grizzly bears or like this idea of what relationships were with any of these ecosystems before, perhaps a new historical perspective to understand how people who have lived here and have cohabitated with many of these other creatures, etc., how that was done, right? In reality, not in this created, fabricated sense of it, right? And that then may be another one of those, who can we be, right? I think there is a lot of that happening now, that we're culturally doing a lot of returning to cultivating our home gardens in ways like that refer back to how we did things before all of this chemical, like post World War II chemical fertilizers and herbicides and things like that. So we're figuring out permaculture. We're figuring out how to like have worm cultivating things. Like those kinds of things return us to a reality that is not that fabricated reality of the Last Warrior in the background, but something that's more real. And perhaps that provides for us really revolutionary, but also just old school ways of managing this. And I think that a lot of these pieces in this room are asking us to question how we might do that, circling back.
Yeah, just to close. Sorry. But I do, it's like one of those questions like, would your grandmother recognize it as food, right? And so that's a good question. Would your great-grandmother recognize it? So, and it's interesting on Facebook, I feel like I'm constantly seeing like a study has been done that shows that meditation will change your like, I think actually there's been like a couple thousand years of some monks who said that. They didn't say exactly the way you did, but okay, sure. Yes, we'll do it that way. And so I do think that there's a way in which these things are, again, everything's right here. It's all, we just have to rename it. We just have to reclaim those names. And we have to, and the way you do it, I think, is through these poems and the images. And remember that we're here, we're in the landscape and we are the landscape. So. Oh, wait, one more.
Oh. While we were talking. Well done. High five.
That's the first.
Which, by the way, was a graphic novel, words and images.
Yeah.
It's like she was here with us.
The imagination's well, this has been an incredible conversation. Books worth of conversation, I would say.
And I thank you both so much. I wanted to let you all know that we do have some of, speaking of books, Camille's books for sale here at the front desk. And if you purchase one, she's kindly offered to sign it for you, if that is of interest to you. And we'll have a little reception for you in a few minutes as well down in the lobby, so there'll be more opportunities for conversation and to ask some more questions. So again, thank you both for being here.
Thanks.
Please,